Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today, we're going to talk about risk analysis and analytics with Safran Risk. My name's Ian Nicholson. I'm VP Solutions here at Emerald Associates. I'm a risk analysis trainer and consultant. I've conducted schedule risk analysis in many industries, as well as cost risk analysis. I started using risk analysis on cost estimates and construction projects over 20 years ago. And I started working with schedule risk analysis as the Canadian PertMaster reseller in 2001. And of course, PertMaster became Primavera Risk Analysis in around 2010. Um, and I still train and support that tool as well. A little bit of housekeeping. Users or attendees will be muted during the presentation, but if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the questions section of the chat, and we'll make sure we answer them at the end of the presentation. So, why conduct risk analysis? Well, risk analysis helps our project teams and executives understand and manage the risks to the project. It gets the project team discussing the challenges of the project and gets them focused on the right issues. There's also always a lot of noise around a project, and we really want to focus on the things that are likely to impact the overall project. We're looking at our costs, we're looking at things like near critical paths that can come back and make significant impact to the project. Now, risk analysis is a requirement of many companies' gate approval processes, but that's really not the reason why you should do it. What we really want to do is we want to get the project team focused on the right issues. We want them to understand the dependencies between cost and schedule. Um, I'm in Alberta, and there's a group here called the Construction Owners Association of Alberta, which is essentially a voluntary organization which looks at large projects that are going on in our part of the world, and they do these annual reports about what's going on in the industry. And a few years ago, they identified that project risk assessment is shown to significantly reduce project cost growth. So ask yourself, do you build detailed CPM schedules? Do you develop detailed cost estimates? Well, of course you do. Everybody does. But still, the chances of meeting our project schedule and financial goals are still a lot less than what we realize. Well, how can that be? How is it we do all this work and we still miss the mark? Well, we do detailed CPM scheduling, but the problem is that all of our data is entered as finite values rather than ranges. So we'll say that piece of work is going to take 4 days, three people, $100 an hour. But the problem is things don't always stay constant. Our assumptions change over time. Maybe our assumptions don't match reality. And the project itself changes. The scope changes, the time of year it's being done, the work conditions, all those things can change. And they create issues for our original CPM schedule. Similarly, we detailed estimating, but we have similar problems. Sometimes our estimators are too optimistic or too pessimistic, particularly in a bid process situation. It encourages them to be aggressive. Sometimes the opposite happens. Sometimes estimators add their own contingency and they hide it throughout the schedule or the cost estimate. And the reason they do that is because they know it'll get taken away if they don't hide it. So it's kind of padded in a bunch of different places. Sometimes estimates are built on historical experience, which is no longer valid. And sometimes estimates are based on projects that are larger or smaller than our project, and those estimates may not scale as we expect to match the current project. Now, these items are all what we call deterministic items. Now, what's the problem with deterministic items? Well, the biggest one is they don't take uncertainty into account. And uncertainties can build on one another to make the project very different from what was originally envisaged. Um, there's uncertainty in everything that we do. I can't tell you exactly how long it's going to take me to get to work every day, but I'm going to predict that I can build this multi-billion-dollar project in the middle of nowhere in 3.5 years. You know, so um, it's not realistic to come up to use these deterministic values. Now, historically, on top of that, there's been no easy way to model cost uncertainties and schedule uncertainties together. And what we really need is a probabilistic cost and schedule risk model. Going back again to the Construction Owners Association of Alberta, they found that on average, Alberta-based mega projects experienced a 19% cost growth and a 17% schedule growth. And that's not too surprising because we know that cost and schedule are intrinsically linked. The problem is, how do we visualize and model that linkage? So our need is, we need to be able to model our schedules and costs more accurately. We need to limit our financial exposure. We need to get reproducible results, so we need an audit trail. We need improved likelihood for project success and confidence in our results. And having those will get buy-in from our team members, which will increase the maturity of our process. And ideally, what we want to do is we want to store everything in a common database so we can go back and look at it after the fact. So, solution we're talking about today is Safran risk analysis. Now, Safran risk analysis has some really great features that kind of place it ahead of everyone else in the industry. I mean, they do the standard things like have ranges on estimates and have risk events, but the big one is that our costs can be modeled with the schedule without having to build a resource loaded schedule, which is a lot of work and very difficult to maintain. It also allows us to build logic uncertainties and to essentially model all the moving parts of our project. So this allows us to understand the probability of achieving our end dates and costs. And I'm going to talk about our what we call our JCL, or our joint confidence level. So what's the confidence we're going to be on time and on budget? It helps us understand the key drivers and their effects. It helps us run scenarios and mitigation strategies. So let's dive in. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to walk you through Safran risk analysis. Okay, so when you come into Safran risk, it looks like this. There's a welcome screen essentially that allows you to do a number of different things. And I'm just going to talk about those just briefly before I move on. So the first thing is that I can import a Safran project file, I can import a Primavera XER file, or I can import a Microsoft Project XML file. Now, most people that I work with are using Primavera P6, and we can import those XER files. And unlike Primavera Risk Analysis, we can import right up to the current version of P6. We're not limited to version 15 or earlier. Um, we also have a couple of extra tabs here. Now, the way Safran works is we move from left to right across the top of the screen to build our risk model. Now, there's a couple of tabs here. I just don't have a project open, but there's a couple tabs here I want to talk about. The first one is global risks, and I can define a risk dictionary essentially of likely risks for all of my projects. So if I'm building projects that are fairly similar, I can develop this global risk register and just keep reusing these risks over and over, and I don't have to recreate them every single time. The second thing is that I can create risk calendars, which are also global. So if I'm doing a lot of work in the same part of the world, I can look at my non-work periods due to cold winters or hot summers or high winds or tornadoes or whatever it is that I need to model. I can build those global risk calendars, and I can use them over and over again in my projects. So I get consistency when I'm building my models. All right, let's go back to the home screen. I'm just going to open a project. And you'll see when I do that, a number of tabs get opened up. The first thing is it takes me to the schedule tab, and it shows me a Gantt chart. Now, Safran Risk Analysis is built on Safran Project, which is a competitor to P6 in Europe and the Middle East. It's a fully functional scheduling tool, so I can make changes here, and I can work them in the model rather than have to go back to P6 every time I need to make a change. Um, I can also import or export. So I talked about importing from Primavera, but I can also export to Primavera as well. So when I'm done the model, if I want to put that back in Primavera, I can do so. And the tool has all sorts of information here. So I can go in, for example, and I can create filters. I can create grouping and sorting, all the same kind of things that I would do in Primavera. I can create layouts. So those things make it very easy for me to work within the schedule itself. Now, the next tab over is the Schedule Warnings tab. And the idea with schedule warnings is it's warning me about anything that's going to cause a problem with my schedule when I do risk analysis. Now, in the options, I can tell it the things I want to look for. So I can look for constraints. I can look for lags. I can look for strange relationships like start-finish relationships. I can look for out of sequence, all those kind of standard things that could cause a problem during my risk analysis. Um, there is, in fact, a full DCMA 14 point schedule checker available as well. Um, so if you actually need to go even deeper, you can actually do some quality assurance tests on your schedule using the DCMA 14 point methodology. Now, moving to the next tab, I've got my project risks. Now, the idea here is that for those of you who may have used Primavera risk analysis, we would have risk events in the risk register in Primavera risk analysis, but all of our uncertainties would have to be modeled on the individual activities. Now, that became quite difficult, particularly if there was multiple uncertainties on one activity, because you'd have to figure out yourself what that overall distribution looked like. Now, in Safran Risk, what they've done is they've said, okay, that's kind of a difficult way to do it. Why don't we put all of the uncertainties and all of the risks into one place, and we'll call them project risks. Now, this is a little bit of where Primavera Risk Analysis was going. They had a risk factors module that they developed, but it never really caught on because it was missing some key functionality. But here they've put everything together in one place. So when I have a risk, for example, if I look at my first risk here, my ash cloud, I can define a probability of occurrence of that particular risk, and I can also record the schedule and cost impact of that risk, and those can be different. Now, my impact can have a defined probability. It can be anywhere from 1 to 100%. And I can also have a relative or an absolute impact for that risk. So a relative impact would be a percentage of the duration of the activity, the deterministic duration, where an absolute impact can be defined in hours or days. So I have the ability to switch back and forth. I also have the ability to define a cost impact, and that's quite powerful because what's going to happen is my cost impact um, is if this risk occurs, um, could be quite different than the schedule impact. So the cost impact could be positive while the schedule impact is negative. So, I might choose to outsource some work, for example, and it's going to save me some money, but it's going to cost me some time, or vice versa. So I have the ability to mix and match what these impacts are going to look like. Now, I can also define a pre-mitigated position and I can define a post-mitigated position. And if I define a post-mitigated position, I can define a different probability of occurrence and I can define a different impact, both from cost and schedule perspective. I can also list my mitigation strategies that I'm going to take to get to my post mitigated position. So if there's a cost or schedule impact of that mitigation strategy, I can include that as well. So when I look at the model, all of my costs of mitigation are included. And that's very useful when I want to determine whether my mitigation strategies are worth doing or not worth doing. Sometimes you can develop a mitigation strategy and it costs so much to do it that it's just not worth doing. You're better off just leave the risk the way it is. So again, I can define these pre-mitigated and post-mitigated for cost and schedule all in one place. Now, I can also go in and I can pull in those probabilistic calendars. So I can have a pre-mitigated and post-mitigated position for those. So I can pull those in from that dictionary I talked about before, and I can then use them on my project. So in this case, we're saying, there could be wind speed over 15 meters per second. We can't fly, so it's going to have an impact on our overall project. Now, all of my other risks are defined in here as well. And you'll notice that there's two different risk types. There's a standard risk type and there's an estimate uncertainty risk type. So the difference between those is that my standard risk types can be I can choose multiples, but on my estimate uncertainty risk types, I can only choose one per activity or cost. So why would I want to do that? Well, when I'm looking at estimate uncertainty, I might say, okay, I've got a low estimate uncertainty on this activity, a medium estimate uncertainty on this other activity, and a high estimate uncertainty. Maybe it's 0 to 10%, 10 to 20%, 20 to 30% uncertainty. And I don't want to put two of them. I don't want to put I have a 10% uncertainty and a 20% uncertainty based on my estimate values. So I choose one or the other. And I'll show you that when I do the mapping. Whereas with my standard risk types, I can choose as few or as many as I need to accurately model what's going on. So let's take a look at that. I'm going to go to the risk mapping tab. Now, this is the schedule risk mapping. I'm going to show you the cost risk mapping a little later on. But the idea here is I've got my activities all listed down the side here. And this is grouped by WBS, but one of the things I really like about this tool is on the schedule tab, if I change my grouping, sorting, or filtering, that grouping, sorting, or filtering comes through on this risk mapping. So if I only want to work with, say, the engineering activities, I can create a filter in the schedule tab, and I'll only see those engineering activities here in the risk mapping tab. Now, I mentioned that for a particular activity, I can only choose one estimate uncertainty type. So here's my estimate uncertainty types, and you notice that they're a radio button format. So if I choose one, it turns off the other ones. So I can only choose one of those types. But over here on my standard risks, I can choose as many as I want. So under this agree contract, I've got my communication risk, I've got a governance risk, and I've got a procurement delay risk. And the nice thing about that is the system will keep track of all of those items that I've assigned to that particular activity. And if I just look on the bottom of the screen here, let me just pull this up a bit so we can see it a bit better. I can see here are all of the risks that I've associated with this particular activity. And it shows me here's the impact of each of those and what the impact is going to look like. And if I have a post mitigated position, it'll show me that as well. And if I click on the schedule impact tab, it will actually show me here's all the risks that you've turned on for this particular activity. And here's what this distribution is going to look like. So it actually shows me the black line here is my deterministic duration, which was 10 days. Here's what the overall distribution is going to be like with all of these risks turned on. And if I was to add another risk, maybe I want to add in a risk for, um, let's say for design. If I add that new one in, it immediately recalculates and shows me what that new distribution looks like. Now, this is really useful because sometimes when you're building a risk model, you put a risk on that is inappropriate. For example, I have a 10-day activity here, so it's a very short activity. And maybe I have a risk that has an absolute impact of 100 days. So as soon as I put that on, I'm going to see this, that my distribution shape is going to get spread much, much wider than I would have expected to. So I can immediately see a problem before I run the whole model. And then I'm trying to figure out why my impact is so huge because I mismapped something or I chose an inappropriate impact type. So very useful. It does what it actually does. It does a little mini analysis to come up with this distribution shape. So let me just turn that one back off again, and you'll see that it immediately recalculates again. Now, once I've done my risk mapping, um, what I can do is I can then go and I can run my analysis. Now I'm going to come back to the cost and correlation tabs a little later on. So normally I would keep working left to right, but I'm going to come back to the cost because it's interesting how they've set that up. So I'm going to go to the Analyze tab, and let's talk about the options that I have when I run my risk analysis. So the first thing is that I can choose for any of my risks to have them turned on or off. So I have the ability to just disable a risk by unchecking the include, or I can choose to run in a pre-mitigated or post-mitigated position for a particular risk. So I can flip between them. And this gives me a lot of capability in the tool to do a lot of what if analysis. So I can say, okay, what if this risk is completely removed? What if this risk moves to a post mitigated position? And it gives me a lot of capability of understanding um, what my risks look like, and to answer the questions that the project team is likely to have. Now, a couple of other things, I have what are called focus activities. So when I'm actually running the analysis, a lot of times I don't really care about the last activity in the schedule when I'm doing risk analysis. So the last activity in the schedule is probably there's going to be site cleanup and demobilization and all those kind of things, which I don't really care about. What I want to report against is when do we turn this plant or project over to the owner? So what I can do is I can create a focus activity, and a focus activity can be an intermediate activity or milestone that I really care about and I want to focus on, hence the name. So I can find it very quickly when I'm doing my analysis, and I can base all of my analysis around that particular activity or milestone. Um, now, I can always go find that activity, but if I have a really large schedule, it means scrolling around and clicking up and down and drilling in and finding it. So it's much quicker if I create these focus activities. Similarly, I can do the same with costs, and we'll talk about that when we get to the cost module a little later on. So I'm going to run the analysis, and I can step through. So when I'm actually looking at the analysis, I can click step, and I can just make sure that things are moving the way I expect in my schedule. I can keep stepping through, make sure that any modeling that I have is working properly, and I can do that for as many iterations as I like. When I get tired of doing that, I can just hit complete, and the tool comes up and it gives me my overall histogram for the project. Now, the histogram is very powerful because it shows me each time it ran an iteration what was the result, and that's what these bars represent. And then the cumulative result is represented by this line here. So what it's telling me is that, for example, if I was to look at the 3rd of February, it's saying that 70% of the time I finished on or before that date. So 70% of the hits in my 1,000 iterations of the schedule were on or before that particular date. Now it also tells me that my deterministic result, which was what I was trying to get in the first place, which was September 26th, is only 4% likely to occur. So I'm not very likely to achieve that date of September 26th. If I want to get up to a 70% confidence level, I need to go to February the 3rd. So I'm adding about 4.5 months to the schedule, or I need about 4.5 months contingency to get myself to that level of confidence. Now, as I mentioned, I can actually drill in and I can choose any particular activity in there. So I could go down into my design, for example, and I could say, let's look at when we're going to finalize the design, and it'll give me the results for that. But I can also look at it from the perspective of my focus activities, and then I could just pick finalize design much more quickly without having to drill into it. Similarly, I can look at agree contract or test lens or any of the other focus activities that I've chosen. Now, just before I move on, one thing that's quite powerful here is when I'm looking at the overall, I can actually go into what's called data view, and that will let me look at the iterations of my analysis and see what happened on each particular iteration. So what it does is it actually tells me for each iteration which risks fired, and when they fired, how much of an impact did they have. So if they're green, they had a positive impact. If they're red, they had a negative impact. If they have a red dollar sign, there was a negative cost impact. If there's a green dollar sign, there was a positive cost impact. So I can kind of get an idea of what happened in each iteration of my analysis. And I can even sort it by duration. And I can look, for example, at the shortest overall duration, which was iteration 495. And I can see this is what happened. You can see almost everything that happened was green. So that gave me a positive result. And I can scroll over a little bit further and see if there's any other risks that fired. And it wasn't. So I can see in that case what was my best case scenario. I can also flip it around and say, what was my worst case scenario? So that was iteration 304. And in that case, I was at 946 days. So I was almost double my best case. In this case, I can see again which of my risks fired, and you can see they all were red. They all fired in a negative way. So again, it lets me understand a little better what was going on. And beyond that, if I want to even see what happened on a Gantt basis, I can actually click on the iteration number and it will actually take me to the Gantt chart and show me the results of that particular iteration. So again, I can go in, it gives me a little bit more capacity to understand what happened in my best case and worst case scenarios. Okay, so going back to my graph, um, I can also configure which percentiles I want to look at. So in this case, I'm looking at 70, 80, 50, and 20. You might want to say, you know what, I only care about P70 and P50. Whatever numbers you want to see, you can configure this to show. All right, so the next thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at our tornado graphs or our project drivers. Now, these are interesting because typically in tools like Primavera Risk Analysis, I could only look at which activities were driving the overall project. But because everything comes back to the project risks in Safran, what I can do is I can actually look at it from the perspective of what are the risks that are driving the overall project. So let me just minimize the activities for a second and talk about how those risks work. So what it allows me to do is understand more holistically what is having a big impact on my project. Because remember, I've identified risks. I don't have to go and look at each activity and say, okay, what are the risks on this activity? Why is this activity having such a big impact? I can look at it entirely from a risk perspective, which I find quite powerful when I'm trying to understand what's really driving my project. Now, again, I can look at this overall, or I can look at it from a focus activity perspective. So maybe I just want to look again at what's driving my design. So in this case, if I look at finalized design, I see a different tornado, and it tells me here's what's driving the design process. So in this case, it switched to something different. So I have the ability here to move around and look at different things in my schedule to see what's really driving my results. Now, oftentimes when we're dealing with tornado plots, one of the questions that comes up from the project team is, okay, so you've told me that ash cloud is 65% correlated with the end of the project, and testing overrun is 46%, and e-communication is 44%. And that's all well and good, so I can sort of see relatively what they're doing, but it doesn't really help me understand what is the absolute impact of those. So the question often comes up, okay, at a particular confidence level, how much of an impact is ash cloud having on the project? If I can get rid of that issue, maybe I move somewhere else where ash cloud's not a concern, what's my overall schedule going to look like? And I can look at that from the sensitivity analysis tab. Now, in a tool like Primavera Risk Analysis, to do this, I would actually have to go and run the analysis, turn off a risk, rerun the analysis, turn off the next risk, rerun the analysis, maybe copy all the results into Excel and do a comparison. But here, the tool will do it for me. So what I can do is I can tell it, okay, at a certain confidence level, let's choose P70. Let's look at what happens when we actually run the analysis. And what it's going to do is it runs through and says, okay, here's how much you're going to save at P70 in terms of um, our overall duration if you can get rid of each of these risks. Now, think about how long it would have taken to go and turn off a risk, rerun the analysis, save the result, turn off the next one, rerun the analysis, etc. But to take a lot of time. In Safran, the system does it all for you, so it happens very quickly. And what it tells me is at a P70 confidence level, my testing overrun has an impact of 36 days. My ash cloud has an impact of 33 days. So I can communicate that to the project team and really help them understand what real world impact we're looking at based on those various risks that we've identified. Okay, so I've talked about the schedule side. Let's talk about the cost side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the cost tab. Now the thing about Safran is it's going to let me build my cost worksheet in the tool. So what I can do is I can essentially have a complete cost risk analysis in the tool, which is not built on a resource loaded schedule. So it's built independently. And then the tool allows me to connect those items which are schedule related to the schedule, and the items that are not schedule related, I can just work independently. So this is a huge cost saving from the way we used to do it, which is we'd run the schedule risk analysis, and then we take the results and feed them into the cost risk analysis. What we do here is we just do it all in two different modules and we link them as appropriate. So some costs are schedule related and some costs are not. So for example, material costs typically are not schedule related. You know, once you've got the material, it doesn't really matter when you install it. However, labor cost is very much material or very much schedule related. So if my activities go long, inevitably my labor cost is going to go up. So the idea here is, let me just turn off some columns for a second and we'll come back to them. So I'm just going to turn off the schedule link for a moment. Okay, so here, for example, I've got my fuel system parts. I've got $2.4 million for that. And I've said that I've got a base uncertainty there from 1.9 million up to 2.8 million. And I can map the risks from my project risks to this line item. So for in this case, what I've said is that my parts supply is a risk associated with this particular cost line item. Now, any of the items that I have in my project risks tab that have a cost impact will show up here so I can select them. So again, it's driving back to that project risks, and I can put any of the risks that I want on there. And if I want to put multiple risks on, like I've got here, I can put as many cost risks on a particular line item as I need to. Now I can also put formulas in here. So in this case, I've got my legal costs and I've built a formula in here. So I've got a couple of variables. I've got my cost per day and I've got my duration of the work, and I've put uncertainties around those. So I can actually build a fairly sophisticated cost model based on, you know, what's the quantity that I need? What's the cost of that going to look like? Those can all change over time. I can look at a particular activity or group of activities and put that in the formula as well. So I can do all of these things and build a fairly sophisticated cost model. Now, the next thing that I can do is, once I've built that cost model and I'm happy that I've got a good cost model going and it makes sense, what I can do then is I can link that to the schedule as appropriate. So for each line item, for example, if I look at my fuel system, I can link that to a schedule activity. So in this case, what I've done is I've said, okay, so this is parts for the fuel system. I'm going to say that it's that 25% of that cost, which is my $2.4 million, 25% of that is linked to my activity fabricate fuel system. The remaining 75% is not linked to the activity. So what that means is that as the activity increases or decreases in duration, 25% of my 2.4 million, or about $600,000, will vary, whereas the remainder will only vary with the risks and uncertainties that I've put on that line item. So how does the system do that? Well, what it does is it actually says, okay, here's the duration of this particular activity. It's 20 days. Here's the variable cost that we put on there. So 25% of 2.4 million, which is 600,000. It said that the remainder is not variable, it's fixed. So the day rate then is $30,000 per day. So that's $600,000 divided by 20 days is $30,000 per day. So what's going to happen now is as the duration of that activity changes, the cost is going to change at a rate of $30,000 per day. So if the activity goes from say 20 days to 25 days, then our cost is going to go from 600 to $800,000. So that's going to constantly be changing with each iteration, but the remaining $1.8 million is only going to change around this base uncertainty plus the risks that we've associated with it. So as I mentioned before, what we used to always do was we would say, okay, we have a cost model in a tool like at risk. We've got a schedule risk model in a tool like Primavera Risk Analysis. And we're going to feed the results of the schedule results, or the schedule risk analysis results into the cost model. But now we can do it all in one place and we can link them together. And it's been shown that you get a much better, more accurate result rather than trying to extrapolate data from one system into another system. So by putting this all together, we can get some great results. Now, when I actually run the analysis again, so this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the analysis. I'm going to step through, but this time, instead of looking at it from the perspective of um, my schedule, I'm going to look at it from the perspective of my costs. So you can see that last column there on the far right has iteration value. And as I step through, my iterations change. And you'll notice that these risks light up or gray out depending on whether they're firing in that particular iteration. So sometimes design fires, sometimes parts supply fires, sometimes both fire. Um, And you can also see that my costs associated with this particular activity are changing, okay? And my overall iteration value is taking into account my uncertainty around rates, my uncertainty around quantities, my links to the schedule where appropriate. Everything's all being rolled up into my overall cost for the project. And when I hit complete, I can then in the distribution graph go to the cost section, and it's going to show me the distribution that came out of my cost worksheet. So here's all my line items in my cost worksheet, and here's my overall cost distribution. So in this case, my schedule probability was fairly low. I think it was 14%. My cost probability is around 13%. I can see that here. My deterministic value is 13%. And I can see here that um, here's what this is going to look like, right? So my deterministic cost was 8.16 million. My P70 cost is about 9.6 million. So again, it's saying from a cost perspective, I need to carry, um, a couple of $1 million in contingency, actually about $1 million in contingency, um, to get from my deterministic value up to my P70 value. Now, I could, just like I did with the schedule, I can look at what's driving my cost. So I can see which of my risks are impacting my cost. So in this case, part supply is the big impact, is the big item. Um, and I can see again all of the other risks that are impacting my cost, just like I did with the schedule. And similarly, I can look at it from a sensitivity analysis perspective. Um, and I can look at it from a cost perspective. So again, I can look at it here on a P70 value. What's the big impact on my overall cost? So in this case, although part supply is number one in the tornado, it's actually number two in the cost impact, and number one is the design specification changes. So I can see the results again, go to the project team, and I can have that discussion with them and say, okay, what are the things that are driving our schedule? What are the things that are driving our cost? And we can talk about what do we need to do to get this project on time and on budget. But now I've done my cost and I've done my schedule in the same model, and here's where really gets powerful. I can now look at my scatter plot, and I can look at it from the perspective of, for each iteration of my analysis, where did I end up on cost and where did I end up on schedule? Now, what the system tells me is that I have about a 1% chance of being on cost and on time. Okay, so that's way down here. So these are my two deterministic values. It's about a 1% probability. And that's not that surprising considering that I think it was a 13 and 14% chance of achieving either one of those. So it's fairly low. So now what I said before was that if I end up, if I wanted a P70 confidence level, I needed to be further up here. I needed to be up around $9 million. And if I needed a P70 schedule level or confidence, I needed to be more over here and around February. So I needed to be somewhere in this sort of range. But the problem is if I put those values in, if I say, okay, I'm going to put a finish date in here of, say, the beginning of February, I think it was February 2nd, and I put a finish date or a finish cost in here of 9.2 million. Okay, so that puts me around here. But that's not, when I look at that overall number, that's still only giving me about a 45, 46% joint confidence level. So what I really want is I had a P70 cost target and I had a P70 schedule target, but what I really need is I need to know where I need to be to actually have a joint confidence of 70%. So I want to say what numbers will get and what costs and what dates will, will give me a 70% probability of project success. Because remember, if I'm on time but I'm over budget, I'm not generally considered successful. Or similarly, if I'm on budget but over time, I'm not considered successful. So what I want, instead of individual 70% outcomes, I want a joint confidence level of 70%. Now the system will show that to me because if you look up the top here, it actually has color coded these. And where I need to be at 70% is right between the yellow and the red band. So this dot here that my cursor is on right now is about 67%. And if I move slightly to the right, I pick up this one here, which is at 70%. So what this is saying is, okay, I can get a joint confidence level of 70% if I will accept February 21st is my end date, and my overall cost is $11.3 million. But what's interesting about this is there isn't just one point on this curve that gives me 70%. I could move up here a little bit, say this guy here, and it's 71%. And what I've done here is I've increased my cost up to $11.8 million, but I've pulled my time back from the 21st to the 18th. So the idea here is that P70 confidence level isn't a single point. It's actually a range of values that I could choose. So I could go way up here. Maybe this one's a better choice. Let's see. Yeah, it's a better choice there. So I can go up here and say, okay, if I really need to pull the time back, I could go all the way back to February the 7th, but it would cost me $14 million. And what you see here is there's actually a curve here of P70 values that becomes very steep vertically, curves down, and then becomes very flat horizontally, or very steep horizontally. I'll put it that way. And the idea here is at some point, I can spend all the money in the world and I'm not going to save any more time, or I can spend all the time in the world and I'm not going to save any more money. And the idea here is between when it goes vertical and between where it goes horizontal, there's a curve here, and the project team can choose any point on that curve to be the P70 value that they want to work towards. So the project team can say, we're going to spend a bit more money to save some time, or we're going to let some time slide to save some money, depending on the project priorities. So this is very powerful from the idea of where are we going to end up. Now, people call this they call this like the P70 necklace because it's a series of dots or series of pearls that you can choose to be along that you can choose as a project team to be at in terms of your target to still achieve a P70 result. Now, if you don't have these two things together, if you don't have your cost and schedule in the same tool, it's actually quite difficult to get this kind of result because you've got two different models and the iterations are not the same. So you can't develop that scatter plot very easily. So this is a great way for the project team to visualize the trade-offs that they're going to have to make between cost and schedule. Now, I can similarly, I do have the ability in the tool to generate a probabilistic cash flow. So a probabilistic cash flow means where am I likely to be spending my money? So I can develop that over time to sort of say from a particular perspective, say a P70 or P80 perspective, how much money am I spending each month? Again, because I've linked my schedule and my costs together, I can very easily generate that. And I also have the ability to do distribution comparisons in the tool. So I can look at different scenarios and understand what those are likely to look like. So in this example here, I've got my base plan and I've got a couple of different scenarios which are actually pushing the project later. And again, it gives me some capability in there to kind of understand um, when I'm running different scenarios, what those scenarios are going to look like. So again, I can evaluate my mitigation strategies. Okay, so that's a very quick high-level overview of Safran risk. As I mentioned, I've been working with risk analysis for well over 20 years, and I spent many, many years working with Primavera risk analysis. Now, Safran risk is really powerful because it pulls everything together, and it really gives you a great tool to visualize those trade-offs between cost and schedule. Um, and if you go to Safran's web page, there's a lot of information on there about about building those integrated cost and schedule models and why that's considered best practice by people like PMI and AACE. Okay, so I'm going to flip back to my slides here. And by the way, if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the questions section in the chat, and we'll make sure we get your questions answered. Okay, so some of the clients that are using Safran Risk, they have clients all over the world, and we've got quite a few here in North America as well. Um, what we're finding is that it's become a, the tool of choice for people who need to do integrated cost and schedule modeling. Okay, so if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I don't see any so far, but what happens a lot of times is people sort of think about it and then they come back with a number of questions later on. So my contact information is on the screen now. If you have any questions that you would like to have answered about Safran, feel free to reach out to me. My email address is there, as well as my phone number. Um, and I'd be happy to talk to you about Safran and the capabilities of the tool compared to tools like Primavera Risk Analysis. So there's a question in the chat saying, how does actual cost has been burned already? Is it simply taking out the risks that are no longer applicable? Yeah, so what you can do is once the risk is behind you, what you can do is you can update the cost model to just have the actual cost as opposed to the estimated cost, and then you can turn off the risks. So let's say I had a line item where I said originally it was supposed to be $2 million. It ended up being $2.4 million. At that point, I can turn off those risks because we're past them, and so I can update the model fairly quickly and rerun it. One of the things that's a real struggle when you're dealing with resource loaded schedules is updating those resource loaded schedules as you go through the project is a lot of work, and keeping it in sync with the cost model is a lot of work. But because Safran does them, two models but linked, it's actually much easier to keep everything in sync. Okay. Um, I That's all we have for today. As I said, if you have any other questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and have a great day. Stay
Oh,
safe.
Ian, I don't know if you
Yes,
can.
Shannon.
Yeah, Ali just put in another question into the chat
Oh,
there.
okay.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so if you want to integrate with a cost breakdown structure from accounting, yeah, you absolutely can do that. So one of the things, let me just flip back to Safran for a second. One of the things that's really powerful about the tool is that when you're working in here, it has a great ability to import and export information to Excel. So if you have changes to your structure or you want to update actual cost to date versus the original planned cost and everything, you can do that very quickly by using this import export through Excel. I find it very easy to use. So basically what I would do is I would export the structure, update it in Excel, re-import it, and I'm ready to go. And that's true actually of virtually all of the modules. So when you look at project risks, we have the Excel import export as well. Under risk mapping, we have Excel import export. So all of the modules basically have this ability to exchange information um, quickly and easily, which actually is so much better than having to manually type everything in every time. All right. I think that answers the questions. Um, if there are any others, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer them by email. So again, thanks for joining us today, and have a good day.